I'll have a debate and open it up to conversation and questions and comment again. So if there were thoughts that you wanted to share just now that you didn't get a chance, you will. So Zahed Amanullah is a resident senior fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and I invite you to say a little bit about their work, and has worked in Europe, in Kenya, and published in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and many other globally recognized media outlets. So you're very welcome.
Thanks so much. That was a very moving speech, actually, and it touches on some of the work that we do. I want to take a step back and review the global threats to freedom of religion or belief, because I think we can draw a thread between all of them. One, you have the state-level targeting of religious minorities, as with the Uyghurs and in Tibet. You have the targeting of religious minorities by political parties and candidates. We see it every election, whether in Europe, North America, or elsewhere. We see the targeting of religious minorities by extremist groups, from ISIS to Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, but also far-right groups in the US, Canada, Europe, Australia, New Zealand. We've all heard those. And more recently, we've seen the targeting of religious minorities by online conspiracy theorists. You saw this probably during COVID-19 with QAnon and the like. The thread between all of these is the role of technology and social media companies to exacerbate and amplify these messages. And so that's really the focus that I want to take in sharing some of our experiences working with tech companies in particular. As was mentioned, YouTube, Facebook, now Meta, Twitter, now TikTok, and more are often implicated in the amplification of views that target religious minorities, and actually a whole host of other things, but let's focus on religious minorities. Our work started well over 10 years ago when a lot of these issues weren't well known in terms of the role of social media when it was in its infancy. But we started a few studies in cooperation with some of the social media companies like YouTube and Facebook, looking at, first and foremost, extremist threats, the ever-increasing extremist use of the internet. So like ISIS, for example. And we looked at what kind of responses could be produced in cooperation with the tech companies, what could be done using those platforms and not necessarily cooperating with those platforms at all, and what religious communities themselves could do, and what were their deficiencies, if you will, in tackling this challenge. So our early studies were in counter-narratives. I'm sure you've all heard the term, but back then it was sort of trying to find a way to debunk some of the messaging that was amplifying hatred toward religious minorities. And we were moderately successful in some early times. We have published reports on our website if you want to read more about that, but specifically against ISIS and far-right groups in the United States, where we used the tech companies' own targeting mechanisms that they use for advertising to target messaging toward the same communities that were being targeted by extremist groups. And back then, the sort of ability to catch this messaging was far less than it is now, and actually even now it's not nearly adequate. And we found some successes. We did see, for example, a campaign that we helped produce for an anti-neo-Nazi group in the U.S. actually led to some members of neo-Nazi groups seeking to leave those movements after seeing the messaging. So there's sort of anecdotal evidence that could be useful, but the more we did in pursuing this strategy, we began to see the difficulties. One is, we had cooperative relationships with tech companies. Ultimately, that hits a bit of a wall when it comes up against discussing algorithms and the way the algorithms are used to promote content and transparency around those algorithms. It was an issue when we came to language. We did studies in Kenya and elsewhere showing that targeting of religious minorities in languages other than English was far, far, far less likely to be caught by the systems that were being put in place, which were human moderators. Even AI and machine learning to an extent was really focused on the English language. And we saw the ramifications of this was mentioned in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, elsewhere. I saw it myself personally in Kenya in a study that I did there. And a lot of these challenges have not necessarily been addressed. Even, we did a study, like I mentioned, Kenya in 2017. We did a recent study just now in 2022 ahead of their upcoming elections, and we found that very little had changed in regards to sort of, for example, monitoring content other than in English that targets minority groups, religious minority groups, or extremist recruitment itself. So working with tech companies, we try to be a constructive critic in that we agree to work with tech companies, but we remind them that we're an independent organization and that we have to be true to what we see, and we have to publish our evidence. It creates a bit of a difficult situation in that, do we actually make the decision not to work with the tech companies and rely on governments and pressure governments to then regulate, which of course is happening now in baby steps. We see the Digital Policy Act and the Online Harms bill that's going through in the UK. Small steps, again, not necessarily solving these issues in one fell swoop, but trying to see if there can be some accountability. Where does that leave us? Well, that leaves us with the challenge of, once you work on the tech side, and we'll continue to work on the tech side, continue to do research on how the platforms are being used, continue to identify trends, then the real, only other option is to build resilience within religious communities themselves to push back against what's, targeting them. So we've done a number of projects in this space, and in fact, we've even done some in cooperation with foundations linked to tech companies in order to see if that could be part of the solution. We had a £1 million fund in the UK in 2018 to help local organizations use technology to combat targeting of a wide range of religious and identity groups, from LGBT to anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, you name it. The success of that led to another project in Europe for 10 million euros when we funded a bunch of organizations through Europe. We had a program called the Shared Endeavour Fund with the Mayor's Office here in London. Those were all supported by Google.org, which is, in my opinion, one of the better organizations that are trying at least to solve this issue of the resolving the harms that come from the abuse of technology. But there's such a long way to go. And it will be a combination of all three aspects. Regulation, shining a light on tech companies and ensuring transparency in how they operate, especially with algorithmic amplification and monitoring of extreme content. There's an organization called GIFCT, the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, that is ostensibly independent, but is trying at least to sort of have some sort of a way to audit, if you will, what the tech companies are doing to fight these challenges. And then again, building the capacity of the communities themselves. When you look at the way that religious communities are targeted, they're targeted through narratives about who they are. And this goes back to our original work about counter-narratives or alternative narratives. The religious communities themselves need the skills, the resources, and the courage and support, really, to create their own narratives that are powerful enough and influential enough to push back against the targeting that they suffer. So this is a long, ongoing process. It'll require a lot of coordination. We did a project around the 2020 elections in the US, where we, on a weekly basis, would inform religious minority groups and others of online trends that were targeting them and giving them strategies on how to combat that or protect themselves. And we feel it was moderately successful. This was close to 100 groups in the US, all being targeted in the wake of a major election, which we've seen as a pattern around the world. Elections often is when all these issues surge. So there are things that can be done. There's a lot more that needs to be done, but this is almost a generational struggle. So hopefully we can learn from what we've done in the past and apply to solutions in the future.
Thank you very much. And if you keep thoughts in response to that.